Question about certified lay ministers. This actually was where finally we ended up after the initiative at the 96 General Conference to bring in lay ministry stewards. I was not altogether disappointed that that didn't make it to the floor, because I think to be called a lay ministry steward would hardly, how shall we put it, grip one vocationally. But anyway, what we ended up with was another initiative, the Certified Lay Minister. And I think that that's a tremendous contribution to the church. What I'm arguing for is a paradigm shift to recognize the lay leadership that is already there, and in fact is doing a great deal to form Christian disciples, rather than taking people who show these gifts and moving them into a mode of training that is more oriented towards the clergy model than the lay model. Okay? In other words, it's the case of the Orlando Costas thing, a clergy-dominated church and a laity-dominated clergy, where the clergy are in charge and the laity, knowing that, find other ways to get back at the clergy. Okay? And that means everything from a staff parish relations committee to a trustees or whatever it is. It's a misplaced struggle. So I firmly affirm and support what certified lay ministers are doing. In fact, should we ever get to the point of an order of the laity and a recognition of the office that we presently are calling class leader, if we ever get to that point, I think certified lay ministers could be a vitally important bridging between those two, because you have a leg in each place. Okay? But what I'm really pressing for is to understand that we do not need to give a clergy-oriented approach to anybody who shows gifts of pastoral leadership. That we should rather be recognizing lay people who are already doing this, and far more than any more training, simply need recognition. Okay? And I come back to what I said yesterday. Well, I can give a personal illustration. My cousin in Scotland attends a very old church of Scotland. It's called St. Cuthbert's. It's at the foot of Edinburgh Castle. There's been a church on that site for 1,000 years, actually, which means that at one time they were Roman Catholic. But when I've attended worship there, I have seen the people that they call elders, who are laity, and who, by the way, are ordained in the Presbyterian polity. It's a different ordination from the ordination of the clergy. But they are known as the elders of that congregation. Now, of course, this is a mixed bag. You have some who live up to the title that they're given. There are others who don't really do what they're supposed to do. I mean, as with anything, it's mixed. But the recognition that is there, that's important. Okay? Now, as I said yesterday, you go to the Presbyterians, you meet the elders. The Baptists, you meet the deacons. The disciples, you meet the lay elders. But when it comes to Methodists, it's job descriptions. And every 4 years, the binder gets thicker. You know, and you meet people at district training. Well, I'm supposed to be chair of evangelism. What does that mean, and what do I do? Right? Instead of having the recognition of holding a lay office that identifies us as being leaders in a congregation. Now, the path to this is going to be filled with obstacles. You don't change paradigms by just waving a magic wand, but we start talking. We start talking. And that, I think, is one of the main purposes of a conference like this, that you will go back and start talking and start looking around. Who are the people here who, just suppose we had the office of class leader again, or whatever title we come up with, certainly not lay ministry steward, but something that would serve just as well. What would it look like if that was to be brought back? And who would be the people most qualified for it? Not to get more training, but simply to be recognized. And then I think we'd be on the way. But in the meantime, the certified lay minister has a very important role to play, and should we ever get to this transition, I would say a critical role to play. And I've also said that to local pastors. Local pastors who, again, do training in the clergy mode, but I often wonder what would happen if, rather than constantly trying to find people to fill slots that follow the paradigm of every congregation needs a pastor, I would say, no, they don't necessarily. In fact, there are many small congregations who are much more like an early Methodist society than a congregation. So all of this means loosening the paradigms, breaking the old mold, or to use the current word, changing the template. I'm learning this vocabulary as I go along because I'm an absolute klutz when it comes to computers. Though I do know what it means to upgrade my Pentium. Okay, does that help? Yeah. Because, you see, change like this is never tidy, and it's never regimented, and it's very rarely imposed from on high, but it does begin to come when the grassroots create some kind of a swell. And I think we're getting close to that. Oh, and the other thing, of course, is this. We will never create these changes anyway. It'll be when the Holy Spirit begins to lose patience. And then we'll have the changes coming whether we like it or not. Yeah. Because it's not our church. It really isn't. And if there's anything that disturbs me about our conversation today, it is how church-centered it is. In one form or another, it's all about the church. The church is not the kingdom of God. And the church is not the gatekeeper of eternity either. We are merely meant to go into the world with the good news that God is redeeming this planet. And the message that we should be giving to people is not, would you like to be saved, but it's rather, you are being redeemed, so for goodness sake, get used to it. Because the ground rules are going to change. And you'll be ready for that or you will not. And if you're not ready, you'll be like the 5 foolish bridesmaids who had to cool their heels outside while the feast was going on, and then when they were invited in, all they got was the leftovers. And that's okay too. That's okay too. Now, any other questions for clarification? Yes, please.
So it seems to me that there's something wrong when the clergy are supposed to fix the entire denomination.
Oh yeah, very definitely so. And one of the issues that comes out of this, you see, is the way in which, during what we now call the Second Great Awakening, which was the 1820s and 30s and 40s, it became a clergy-dominated church primarily because of the preaching. And that's why seminaries today are constantly being told, send us better preachers, right? As if preaching is going to solve it all too. And of course there are just enough television preachers to continue to feed that misapprehension. The way in which the clergy today are being entrusted and, as you put it, are being burdened with an impossible task is that we need to open up the arteries. And the arteries of the church are the channels of grace through which the Holy Spirit can genuinely engage us in mission and ministry. We're blocking those arteries by constantly trying to lead a church through ways that, in fact, do not honor that. We try to organize, we try to energize, we try to educate, we try to emulate. And as I mentioned before the break, who gets all the brownie points at annual conference? It usually is the church that's built a new building or has increased its membership the most, etc., etc. We're not asking, where are the real battles going on right now? And the battles are very often going on in places where, of all people, the clergy need most support. But because they're not producing the expected results, they not only don't get support, they don't even get recognized. So the way around this is, are there ways in which we can re-tradition our early Methodist heritage to provide mutual support between clergy and lay leadership? Now, frankly, for myself, the place that I find this most is in my own covenant discipleship group that includes 3 of us who are clergy. 2 of us are retired, myself and the former conference council director, which is, by the way, not his congregation. He comes to this group, though, and the present pastor of the church. And we're able to talk together there, not about the sort of things that concern clergy leadership per se, or even lay leadership per se, but rather, are we all following the teachings of Jesus Christ? And that starts to open the channel of grace. Okay? So that's one place in which we can do this. Now, as I've argued also, we need clergy groups to meet professionally, and there are other kinds of small groups that come out of early Methodism as well, and I think we'll hear about some of those from David later on. But the fact of the matter is that if we want a place where we can mutually support each other, clergy or lay, then I would offer covenant discipleship as a place where we can do that. In the meantime, I think it means in our preaching and in our teaching and in the example that we give, we should be looking not for the upkeep of the church, but rather for the mission of the church, which is to tell the world what we know. And what we know is God is redeeming this planet. And we can point to ways in which that's happening. What we cannot do is to tell God how and when to finish the job. But we can point to where God is at work. And that begins again to open channels of grace. All of the things that I have remembered from my own youth in the church and then my own training for ordination and everything else, I didn't answer a call to come and help the church be better. My goodness me, what a thankless task. I answered the call to ministry because God laid on me a charge to help tell the world to get ready because the world is being redeemed. And the ground rules are going to change. And the last thing I want to hear from you in eternity is, why didn't you tell me? Because I could have told you. That's what got me into ministry. It's the charge of proclaiming the coming reign of God.
Hi, Lady Donald from Delaware. I just, knowing what I know of your work, in God does not foreclose. And when you say the ground rules are going to change, I would just like to hear you expand a little bit more on what you mean by that phrase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the book you're referring to got me in the crosshairs of a wing of the church, where in many ways I still am. But those of you who are not aware of it, this book came out in 1990, and it basically was to argue theologically for the coming reign of God as a universal promise of salvation. Of course, the charge that usually comes when you use the word universal is a universalist. I've never yet heard anyone use that word and know what it means, though. And if you say, well, does that mean that God is saving the whole world and everyone in it? I answer, yes, it does mean that. And the reason it means that is, quite frankly, that that's what Jesus Christ promised. And when you start to look at all of the scriptures, and of course you can find all of the texts that would say that the naughty people are going to end up somewhere very nasty and the good people are not, and vice versa, that's a scurrilous argument, because I think that the whole meaning of the cross is not that that offers us a personal ticket to eternity, but rather that is God's declaration that this muddle right now of a fallen planet is going to be solved, and it is going to be redeemed, and in the meantime, here's my son. Jesus Christ is God's declaration that what's going on planet Earth right now is not a game, but rather a mystery, and it is a cosmic mystery. The two key chapters for this, Romans 5, Romans 11. And in Romans 11, Paul says, the whole creation, and this is a word from the Jerusalem Bible, not the new one, the old one. Beautiful word. The whole of creation is on tiptoe to see God pull this off. Right? And people, of course, come back with the old chestnuts. Well, what about someone like Adolf Hitler? Right? Well, we don't know. But if you want to hazard a guess, it would be that Adolf Hitler will be on permanent latrine duty in Tel Aviv. And enjoying it, you see. In other words, God's justice is always redemptive. It is always redemptive. And you know what the psalmist said, of course, if I make my bed in hell, I'm going to find you there anyway. Now, I think that this is one of the perspectives that really we have to work through theologically as a church, so that with confidence we can say to the neighborly pagan, whom I quoted earlier on, as, keeping a neater yard and better behaved dog and all the rest of it, I can't go to him and say, good person though thou art, well behaved though thy dog is, and neat though your yard is, until you make your personal decision for Jesus Christ, I'm afraid you're going to a nasty place and I'm not. And of course, that's always the prerogative of people who see God's salvation in a very sectarian way. Right? It's the old syndrome of, well, at least I'm not like you. Right? So I think our soteriology has to be reworked, our eschatology has to be reworked, and certainly our ecclesiology has to be reworked. And frankly, I think this has to be done not just in seminary settings, but rather in dialogue with our lay leadership, the lay leadership I've been arguing for. The theologian perhaps that has meant most to me is Jürgen Moltmann. Moltmann, who's still living, began his work as a theologian as a prisoner of war in England after World War II. And interestingly, as the prisoners were being marched to church on a Sunday morning, the minister of the local Methodist church was Frank Baker, who later came over to this country to head up the Wesley Works project. And Moltmann remembered Baker and remembered the hospitality that Baker gave. And Frank Baker said to his congregation, we're going to have some German prisoners of war here, and you are to accept them as brothers in Christ. What you might call good pastoral leadership from a clergy person. But in any event, Moltmann tells where, and this was after he'd become established as a theologian, visiting the concentration camp at Treblinka. And Treblinka was one of the worst of the killing camps. Very effective, very efficient. and they've now levelled it so that there are no buildings left, but there are stone memorials all over the campus. And the grass is lush green because of the depth of human bone dust. And Moltmann tells how he felt impelled to kneel down and grab 2 handfuls of this prickly soil. And his words were, "These children must rise." You see, our soteriology, when it becomes personalized, really flies in the face of everything that's in the gospel. How can you say, "I am saved," when we still have the children of Auschwitz and Treblinka? And for that matter, the 30,000 who will have died today before sunset. It's got to be phrased differently. It's got to be traditioned differently. It's got to be traditioned by a people who belong to planet Earth, which God so loved that God came to be one of us and to redeem us. I could go on, but I hope I've answered your question.
I'm sorry,
But, well, if you didn't hear the question from Amy, it's what do I mean by getting ready for this salvation? Well, the answer is, first of all, to accept the ground rules. And Jesus gave us those very clearly. The first are going to be last. The last are going to be first. The meek will inherit the earth, not the bullies, which sometimes leaves me wondering how it is that so many Christians today seem to accept bullying as quite normative, when it's not. Okay? So the ground rules are going to be startlingly different. But the one thing I would say is this: we're all going to be surprised. We're all going to be surprised. I quoted yesterday this editorial from Harry Reasoner. It was on 60 Minutes in 1979. Anybody who's interested, by the way, I carry around in my little handy-dandy folder, I carry around a transcript of this editorial, if anybody's interested, and I'm sure that we can make a copy for them if they would like it. But he finishes by saying, "One quiet Christmas morning, the touch will take." Now, on that quiet Christmas morning, should we still be here when it happens? We will be anyway, either now or in eternity, because there are rules of this universe that we're just beginning to glimpse that I think point to all of this, namely the laws of relativity and time and matter and everything else. But when we do inherit this kingdom, and when this morning comes, my prayer is that I will have the good sense and the courtesy to accept it and not resent the fact that all this other lot are getting in free of charge. I hope I will be able to rejoice, because I find, quite frankly, that there are signs of God's kingdom in all sorts of places and in all sorts of ways. And by the way, just to repeat myself ad nauseam, which is about the limit of my Latin anyway, that when we look at the world and what really is staring us in the face, it's so obvious. I think laity understand that instinctively a whole lot better than us clergy, because they see it. And what they're waiting from clergy is a theological affirmation that they're seeing things correctly, which they are. Which they are. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
You've said that clergy leadership is or should be about preaching and teaching the gospel. And I'm wondering what you would say about the role of clergy in discerning and casting a vision for the congregation with lay people, I suppose, but is that all done within the context of preaching and teaching? Or is there a kind of wider role that I would say would come into the call to order?
Yeah. Well, my answer to that would be yes. and let me elaborate a little on that, because obviously the person who occupies the pulpit and the person who teaches, and by the way, also is responsible for other people who teach in terms of getting the gospel clearly taught. I mean, that's all our role. And obviously it involves hands-on leadership in ways that go beyond strictly preaching and teaching. And of course that includes the sacraments. But where I think we need to develop a collegiality here is that if we had this lay leadership recognized and active and effective, those of us who are clergy would want to be in constant dialogue with them. Now, I remember Zan Holmes describing, are you familiar with the name of Zan Holmes? Used to be at St. Luke's Church in Dallas before he retired, African American. And by the way, when we were on faculty together at Perkins, I used to say to him regularly, you know, Zan, you and I should write a book together. We could leave the pages blank, but with Holmes and Watson on the cover, it would sell like hotcakes. But he never picked up on it. Well, anyway, and I wouldn't have minded being his limey sidekick either. But the thing is, he always ran through his sermon with his lay leadership before he preached it. And it wasn't simply technique, it was theological grounding. Is what I'm saying here resonating with what you know to be the truth of the gospel, you see? Now, preaching and teaching obviously requires extensive training, being certified lay ministers, etc. All of that requires training, but there's an inherent common sense about the laity in terms of the gospel that I don't think we're fully recognizing. And that's where what you've described could, I think, be a very creative partnership. Now, as for the papers that you're writing, like I said, be circumspect. It's rather like when you're learning to drive, you know, you always keep 2 miles below the speed limit and you always indicate where you're going until you finally get your driver's license, and then you can loosen up a bit, you see. So do what you have to do, okay? But the thing is that the creative partnership that you're lifting up as a possibility, I think could be very, very powerful. Yeah. Okay. Well then, very quickly, let me raise simply some ideas. Like I said, I'm not presenting you with any blueprint. I'm not saying that this is the way it's got to be. The exciting thing about spiritual renewal is you never know what's going to come up next. And all you have to do is not only go back to John Wesley, but go back to the 200 years preceding John Wesley. And one of the most creative centuries in the whole, well, 2 creative centuries really, were the 16th and 17th centuries before we ever got to Wesley. The tremendous upheaval of the English Reformation, where Henry VIII, who sort of strode the country like a colossus and eventually became as big as one, but Henry VIII declared himself, I am now the head of the church. That's it. And if you say that I'm not the head of the church, you're a traitor. Not just a heretic, you're a traitor. And as I mentioned yesterday, one of the abbeys, all of which he demolished, Henry VIII closed all of the monastic orders in England overnight, which is why they're now in ruins for the most part. And the last one to be closed was Glastonbury, very close to Salisbury, where we had the Wesley pilgrimage. And the abbot there, it was one of the wealthiest ones, the abbot still refused to acknowledge that Henry was the head of the church. And that man was executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Anyone who wants to know what that means, ask me personally, because it was ghastly, a ghastly way to die. And this was an abbot of a monastery. So there was ferment, all sorts of things going on. And then, of course, you had Queen Mary, who tried to make the country Roman Catholic again, and then you had Elizabeth, who made it firmly Protestant. And she was really a very pragmatic. In fact, I admire Elizabeth I, perhaps more than any monarch that I know in history, because she finally got England on a track where the established faith of the country was to be Protestant. They were talking about all sorts of things and disputing about all sorts of things, and one of them was the Eucharist. What actually happens to the elements here? Do they change, as Rome says, or not? And Elizabeth was asked about that, and she's reputed to have replied, Christ was the word that spake it, he took the bread and brake it, and what his word doth make it, that I believe and take it. She could have run for president here, for goodness me. The thing is that that was an exciting century, and then the next century, a civil war, which in large measure was religious as well. And that's where you got the first people coming over here to get away from that and to find religious freedom. Right? But the Civil War nonetheless took place. And then you had the restoration of the monarchy. England was a republic for 11 years until the monarchy was brought back in 1660. And Charles II remains a signal monarch too, because it could have been a bloodbath, but instead he made it an age of merriment. And half the dukes and duchesses in England today are descended from the results of his merriments. The thing was, these were exciting centuries, you see. So to understand Wesley and what he brought, and what you're going to hear presently, was very important to remember the past. And that's what we're talking about now. How do we look to the future? When in fact, we've got some history to make up. And I've alluded already to one of the big things that we still need to outgrow, and that is the former central jurisdiction, with which we're still living in large measure. So, let me throw out a few ideas. First of all, if we were to have a recognized lay office, I think our deployment of clergy could immediately become far more creative. The present template is every congregation, large or small or in between, needs a pastor. I would question that. If we had lay leadership in place, then our appointments of clergy could be as varied as the situations we have. We could still have pastorates in which the gifts and grace of stationed clergy could be realized, but we could also have circuits. Not the kind of circuits that are the result of having to pool resources, but the kind of circuits that the rest of world Methodism still has. Namely, all churches are in circuits and share the staff. And we could do that very creatively too. It would mean, of course, looking at all sorts of other implications of this. Again, you hear rumblings of these sort of things, but I've mentioned one already with the church and community workers, namely equitable salary. And quite frankly, this is where American Methodism is out of sync with the rest of world Methodism, because the rest of world Methodism understands equitable salary to be the norm. And we could have interaction between large churches serving as resources and circuits that are staffed by teams of clergy who work cooperatively. Now, these concepts are not new. Probably you're coming from annual conferences that are experimenting with this in one form or another. But to give connectional clout to this will require a recognized lay office of lay leadership. Lay preaching would be part of that. Of course, we didn't call them lay preachers, we called them lay speakers, and now they're being called lay servants. But that, I think, misses an important point. Because when they were called lay speakers, I can't think of any group of people in the church all dressed up with nowhere to go than the lay speakers, who would be trained and then would never be asked. Okay? Well, instead of approaching this as a challenge, it simply was left that, well, I guess they're not very popular, No, that wasn't. In the Murfreesboro district right now, we're looking at this and are thinking seriously of reintroducing Sunday evening worship precisely to let lay people preach. And that's going to require, however, an education of the congregations. Because the congregations are known to reduce attendance on a Sunday morning, on Laity Sunday, if a lay person is preaching. Whereas in fact, lay preaching could bring a distinctive gift if we had a prepared congregation. Now, a Sunday evening service would be small, but on the other hand, I think it could be a means of grace. And a further thing, of course, is, as I've been arguing all along, that a lay-led discipleship can really open up the arteries of the church.
One of the things that's done there that I find just so rich is that for 6 weeks after annual conference, the appointed pastor is not in the fold. Now that's, for many congregations or communities, that's by necessity. It takes that long for the pastor to return from annual conference. But even in those communities that are close and there's no travel involved, it's lay speakers who are in the pulpit. It's rich. Mm-hmm. And I just offer that not as a question, but there are things in our global in our global connection that I think we're not acknowledging or even using.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, and for two reasons. Number one, not only is this something that the United Methodist Church and its related central conferences need to look at more closely, but we also need to be looking at the whole of world Methodism that is not part of the United Methodist Church, where you have a lot of autonomous Methodist churches. And I'm thinking here particularly, for example, of Latin America, right? Where world Methodism recognizes this. I mean, for starters, other churches, United Methodist churches or just Methodist churches, that have bishops, it's strictly a term limit. And they're expected to return to the pastorate when they've served their time. And likewise, the role of lay preaching. I think we have that in us if we could open the way to it again. But it means recognizing that lay leadership does not have to be picked out of the congregation and specially trained. That's important, and when it happens, it's a great service to the church. And again, let me mention the certified lay ministers as an example of this. Right? But the lay leadership that is there anyway, doing this, but not being given the recognition that would pull them into full partnership with the clergy. Right? And I'm glad you raised that example, because I can imagine what it's like. When I was in South Africa a few years ago, a group of women called the Bible Women were equally powerful and were a force to be reckoned with. Right? So, in point of fact, all of this is going on. The question that I would leave you with is, as far as possible, don't let's get in the way. One of the criticisms leveled at Wesley, of course, was that he was an enthusiast, a fanatic. And this went back to the time of the Civil War in England, where you had what were called vulgar prophets. And the word vulgar didn't mean what we think of it today. It simply meant that they were ordinary people who went out into the open air and preached, very often rabble-rousing. And of course that led in part to the Civil War. So to be called an enthusiast was not a welcome title to be given. But on the other hand, look how lay preaching started. If you read the account of how Thomas Maxfield was eventually recognized, first by Susanna, by the way, not by John himself. So these things happen. The wisdom of the church is, will we let it happen? Or will we retreat a little, entrench in familiar ways, and thereby block the arteries of what the Holy Spirit is trying to do. One of the things that I treasure from my own upbringing in Methodism in the north of England are all the lay people that I can remember who were in fact doing this. In the pastorates that I've had, the lay people who were doing this. I just think that we need to start preparing for an order of the laity that will recognize this. And as you go away from a conference like this, agitate, stir things up, make sure that the arteries are not being clogged. Because what we're really doing is asking why, instead of saying whether lay preaching or lay speaking can be improved or whatever, why don't we start asking congregations, why don't you support it? And why don't you come and hear the preaching from people like this? Preaching is not oratory. I can tell within 2 minutes whether I'm preaching to a congregation that is going to be a partner with me in this proclamation of the word. And if they're not going to be a partner, I know it's uphill for the next 20 minutes. But when I sense the response, then the preaching of the word is being heard.